Stock buybacks. They suck. Or do they? Stock buybacks have been receiving a less than flattering reputation in recent years, with large sums of money allegedly being allocated to the filthy rich and away from workers. Trump's Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 had brought the debate on stock buybacks into focus. After the Trump tax cuts, 57% of corporate tax savings went to stock buybacks in contrast to 20% for job creation commitments and 6% went to wage increases. Hence, major criticism was levied against the tax cuts on the basis of perceived inequality that favours buybacks and disproportionately benefiting the rich. This appears to be the case since the richest tenth of households owned an average of $1.7 million in stock, while the bottom 50% owned an average of $11,000 in stock in 2019. The vast majority of the top 10% of households also all own stocks. Not to mention that a sizable fraction of these buybacks, around 25%, come from a group of 5 companies called the buyback monsters. These are Apple, Alphabet, Meta, Microsoft, and Bank of America. Buybacks seem to be the norm, as within 14 out of 18 industries, most companies spend over half of their profits on buybacks. But before we continue, we need to ask what stock buybacks are, and before that, we need to explain what stocks/shares are. A good amount of my audience probably understand this, but for the sake of brevity, it wouldn't hurt to explain. A stock or share represents a partial ownership of a business. For instance, if a business issues 10 shares, a shareholder owning one of these shares would own 10% of the business. People buy these shares because they usually pay dividends and sometimes allows the shareholder to have some influence in the running of the business. Stock buybacks or share repurchases refers to companies repurchasing their own stock from shareholders in an open market, which limits the supply of shares, boosting its value. A rise in the value of shares benefit corporate executives by raising their stock-based compensation and can cash out their personal stock holdings. This, however, supposedly leads to less resources for research and development, capital investments, new technologies, and new jobs. Now, share repurchases can be made either by an offer at a fixed price, usually above market rates, also known as a fixed price tender offer, a Dutch auction offer where shareholders choose the lowest price that they will buy while companies choose the highest price they will sell, a purchase in the open market, a transferable put right option where the firm offers the shareholder the right to sell at a fixed price within a certain time interval, or by target stock repurchases where shares are purchased from shareholders of large blocks. Stock buybacks were illegal, or at least potentially faced civil and criminal penalties until 1982 when the SEC relaxed these rules. There were 1992 tax deductibility changes for corporate pay, which included a loophole for CEO performance pay via stock options. These actions led to 54% of corporate earnings being used to buy their own stock from 2003 to 2012 versus 5% of earnings back in the early 1980s. America also is the least regulated on stock buybacks of any country with a major stock exchange. It has been argued that stock buybacks take profits out of companies that could otherwise have been used to invest in workers and future growth. This line of reasoning has been put forward by a study from the Progressive Roosevelt Institute. From 2015 to 2017, 60% of US company profits were spent on stock buybacks. The same study that reported this figure had focused on restaurant, retail, and food manufacturing industries because they were low-wage, supposedly economically insecure, and disproportionately women and minorities. The food manufacturing industry spent 58.2% of their profits on stock buybacks, retail spent 79.2%, and the restaurant industry spent 136.5%. Clearly, the restaurant sector funded their buybacks with debt, which seems to be somewhat of a trend with a lot of profitable companies. The Roosevelt Institute claimed that McDonald's could have paid all 1.9 million of their workers $4,000 more per year at the time, while Starbucks could do the same with $7,000 if they didn't spend any money on stock buybacks. While the Roosevelt Institute acknowledges that a stock buyback ban will not achieve a policy goal of helping workers, it may remove one method of companies distributing cash away from workers. Furthermore, share prices get an immediate spike after a buyback announcement, with some groups like short-term investors benefiting more than long-term investors, like pension/retirement funds. Yet, one analysis shows that companies invest a higher proportion of profits in stock buybacks face lower total shareholder returns. Corporate executives could instead exploit buybacks, since announcing them would signal that the executive thinks they're undervalued, increasing market demand. This leads to their share prices rising. Shareholders with more long-term interests, such as retirement funds and endowments, can be argued to be hurt by buybacks, assuming that the process lowers investment and wages. Moreover, African Americans and Latinx in Latin, you know the thing. These groups hold more wealth in pensions or retirement plans, so could be disproportionately hurt by buybacks. It's issues like these that have clamored the way for the Stock Buyback Tax, which is part of US President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which I did an analysis on in my previous video. The Committee on Taxation projected that the Stock Buyback Tax would raise $74 billion from fiscal years 2022 to 2031. The tax is an excise tax, which means it is not part of the US income tax provisions and even affects parent companies with at least 50% control of the company engaging in stock buybacks, as well as foreign affiliates, contrary to previous excise taxes. This excise tax can't be used to deduct a company's corporate tax. Despite this, it also has many exemptions, as the tax doesn't apply to companies with repurchases under $1 million. Regulated investment companies, repurchases that contribute to an employer pension or similar employee plans, repurchases that are treated as dividends for tax purposes, tax-free corporate organizations, and purchases by a securities dealer in the ordinary course of business. Companies repurchase shares for numerous economic reasons, such as redistributing excess cash flows due to declining investment opportunities, increasing earnings per share by reducing the number of shares, signal that the stock is being undervalued, realize tax benefits, and much more. These reasons make sense for the firm, but not necessarily the rest of the economy. And that is where the heart of the question of the tax lies in, whether stock buybacks are beneficial to the economy, and to what extent. Some aspects are easy to decipher, such as the tax advantage, but one particular dilemma in this discussion will be quite difficult to answer, and that is how stock buybacks affect investment. Some research shows that share buybacks are associated with lower unemployment, capital spending, and research and development. This could also be due to higher market concentration/monopoly power, and if so, the few companies would have less incentive to not engage in buybacks due to less competition. Moreover, it has been argued that companies buy back stock because there is a lack of investment opportunities, and the cash provided to shareholders via buybacks can circulate in capital markets to fund investment in other companies to generate growth. But some studies suggest this is not the case, as shareholder payouts via buybacks dwarf new stock issuances by publicly traded companies, meaning funds are being pulled out of the stock market and the share of investment in new and small companies is actually declining. An IMF study suggested debt-funded payouts weaken credit quality while greater dividends and buybacks slow investment, with some evidence of repurchases suppressing innovation. Stock buybacks have been associated with falling investment, but we aren't exactly sure if this is because there has been an environment of shrinking investment opportunities which incentivizes companies to use buybacks to redistribute funds, or if buybacks cause less money to be poured into investments. In fact, the following evidence suggests the former. Various other studies have found that 95% of the funds from repurchases are reinvested in other public companies, that there is very little evidence that economies experiencing declining investment have also experienced large increases in stock buybacks and dividends, and that stock repurchases were 41% of earnings, leaving plenty of money for investment. Even if repurchases cut investment, we aren't sure if this is a bad thing, since it would depend on the returns of such hypothetical investments. This aspect of the stock buyback topic seems quite important, and hence I will go through the aforementioned studies in greater depth in a future video. Buybacks may also be increasing debt, as more companies borrow money to fund shareholder payouts. One study found that 42% of industrial American firms with positive payout had an equity or net debt issue the same year, with 36% being unable to fund those repurchases without the proceeds of those issues. Even Goldman Sachs pointed to stock buybacks as a major driver of corporate debt in the last decade. In spite of the Roosevelt Institute's many critiques of stock buybacks, they seem to understand that the problems they are concerned about would still exist even if stock buybacks were banned or mitigated, but it closes one major channel of alleged financial leakage from productive circulation. One 2008 study found a close relationship between stock repurchases and stock option compensation, benefiting executives and their pay, especially since the higher share prices from buybacks encourages the exercising of stock options. Other reasons suggested by a different study is that buybacks are used to offset dilution of shares from stock options, such as the exercising of employee stock options, since if a worker buys shares from their stock options, the number of the company's shares increases, which reduces the share's value. But a more significant rebuttal to this point about executive artificial pay is that critics would point out that pay rises would occur by share prices increasing. But on average, companies who conduct buybacks have their share prices rise after the announcement by 3.5% and continue to rise thereafter above their peers by 12%, and the price will only increase if investors see the buyback as value enhancing. They may elaborate that if there is a lack of profitable investment opportunities, but the company spends money on investment anyway, then they are not making effective use of their capital, which means their share prices fall. This reinforces the idea that companies are justified in redistributing excess cash flows to shareholders. It could also be argued that because buybacks generally increase share prices, it increases capital gains tax payments. You might have noticed that I have mentioned previous studies claimed companies who engage in stock buybacks perform worse, which contradicts the 12% figure. As a consequence, I will also look into these studies in greater depth in a future video as well to understand the contradictions regarding this issue. Other concerns with the tax is that companies may use stock buybacks to discourage mergers and takeovers, since repurchases boost stock prices, which increases the cost of an unfriendly takeover. So an introduction of the tax would make this protection measure more costly instead, leading to more mergers. In addition, the Conservative Tax Foundation further argues that the excise buyback tax will eliminate 7,000 jobs. With stock buybacks, investors have a choice on whether to sell stock, yet investors don't have a choice on whether they receive a dividend. Hence, it can be argued that stock buybacks are a more efficient way for shareholders to decide how to allocate resources. Yet some may argue that since companies engaging in buybacks signals to shareholders that they don't have productive investments to throw money at, their excess cash can instead be distributed to government services like schools and healthcare via the stock buyback tax. But a tax on buybacks could instead encourage companies to hoard their money, which companies did pre-2017. And here we see the managerial agency problem commonly pondered in finance. A firm with excess cash reserves may be associated with lower firm value because self-interested managers can instead misuse those funds to benefit themselves instead at the expense of the company. Stock buybacks would be a way to avoid that problem. Furthermore, instead of the tax encouraging investment, dividends could instead be favored. This is quite important as Biden is considering raising the excise buyback tax to 4%. If the excise tax is raised, it could increase dividends at the expense of buybacks, where dividend tax revenue rises, while excise and capital gains tax revenues for buybacks fall. In fact, a study by James Porterbar analyzed the 2003 American Act that cut dividend and capital gains taxes and predicted that the tax reform would increase dividends by 20%. Using this study, the Tax Policy Center estimated that a 1% rise in a tax on stock buybacks will increase dividends by 1.5%. Encouraging more dividends may be more beneficial for investors, especially since a higher dividend yield is more correlated with S&P 500's return than a higher buyback yield. For instance, dividend yield explains 54.9% of the S&P 500's return over 5 years, while buyback yields only explain 10.2%. Not to mention that dividends are harder to manipulate than share buybacks, but require a longer-term commitment from corporations as well, since dividend payments are permanent. Now, we should be able to logically surmise that estimated excise tax revenues may be lower, since companies will shift from share repurchases to more dividends instead, while increasing tax revenues generated from dividends. But tax revenues may be less than expected, since the buyback tax only gone into effect in January 2023, meaning some companies may have dramatically increased their tax-free stock buybacks in the second half of 2022 to limit their buybacks in 2023, which would have otherwise been taxed. But I haven't seen any evidence for this, so we'll have to wait and see if this theory actually pans out. Speaking of dividends and taxation, a common complaint in the stock buyback debate is that dividends and stock buybacks are treated differently in terms of taxes, yet are both ways of returning money back to shareholders. Dividends have been taxed for a long time, but the buyback tax just happened this year. Critics aim to close this so-called tax differential between stock buybacks and dividends. When it comes to looking at the tax disparity with dividends, the 1% stock buyback tax is eclipsed by the top rate of 23.8%. Since capital gains taxes are more relevant to buybacks, we'll use this. Capital gains are taxed on average 2.1%, while dividends are taxed on average 12%, so the tax disparity is roughly 10%, assuming no foreign taxes on dividends or capital gains. The 1% buyback tax should reduce the differential by 10%, so has a predictably pretty small effect. If we are aiming to eliminate the tax differential entirely, then Penn Wharton created a model where they modified the tax rate on buybacks with a lower bound estimate requiring 1.6% to eliminate the tax differential between buybacks and dividends, a baseline estimate requiring 4.6% to eliminate the tax differential, and an upper bound estimate requiring 9.6% to eliminate the tax differential. As a small comment near the end, some of the enforcement procedures are still being discussed. For instance, certain corporate reorganizations and repurchases associated with completed liquidations are excluded, but some stock buyback issues still need to be clarified for the IRS and a regulatory body, such as questions on whether special rules should apply for repurchases of preferred stock. There are also netting issues where apparently the tax is based on net repurchases rather than gross repurchases, where the latter number is subtracted by issues of new stock, like employee stocks, but some issuances of stock are not counted. Overall, a tax on stock buybacks would lead to more dividends, and the rough projection of $70 billion in tax revenue could be affected by substitutions in dividends as well as greater buyback activity in 2022. As for whether this tax is a good idea in the first place, that depends on whether the notion of stock buybacks are a good idea in the first place. As we have seen from this video, enacting a stock buyback tax, or any policy intended to limit buybacks, can either force companies to increase investment and wages, make them hoard more funds instead, be less likely to fend off mergers, less incentives for executives to artificially increase their pay, more money spent on bad investments which can lead to a fall in the share price, less money for shareholders to spend on other profitable investments, lead to better performing companies, or lead to worse performing companies, and much more outcomes. Of course, many of these are contradictory effects, and we don't know to what quantitative extent they will occur, since the studies I use disagree on their findings. As a reminder, I'm going to delve further into these studies in future stock buyback videos, one could say a series. Regardless, the tax may not be that significant, and may just be one of many factors in companies considering repurchases, especially considering it's just 1%. There might be tax compliance now when it comes to doing a buyback, but again it's just 1%. Even for me, as someone who is biased towards lower taxation, this 1% tax doesn't bother me that much, considering how low it is. Personally, I would prefer tax cuts in other areas, as this policy doesn't matter that much in the grand scheme of things, provided its rates don't rise. But what if those rates were higher? Then the question would once again be relevant. Is the stock buyback tax a good idea? Well, again, I can only answer that by whether stock buybacks are a good idea, and that question itself will need to be answered in future videos. I've gone through a lot of financial theory, but not as much empirical evidence, but those series of videos on my stock buyback saga may include whether stock buybacks hurt investment, whether companies perform better on the stock buybacks, and looking into the stock buybacks of oil companies. There are also many online critics of stock buybacks, and I am intrigued to what extent their arguments stand to scrutiny, and all of this will accumulate to a video answering whether stock buybacks should be banned. This video is also part of a series analysing the many aspects of Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, but we didn't have much time to delve into that policy, but my next video on that will look at Biden's climate visions. If you managed to watch for this long, thank you, I really appreciate it. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give a like and comment, as it really helps my video in the YouTube algorithm. And if you like economics and political commentary, consider subscribing. Maybe follow me on my Twitter, and see you later.